Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gap between academics and practical marketing. Every week, we sit down and go deep behind the science that powers great marketing today. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today, we're diving into the fascinating topic of achieving behavior change inside our companies and inside our brands. Let's get into it. So, Richard, so many of our conversations have focused on marketing and data and how we understand humans and how we can mix these things together to make our marketing more effective. But in some of the before our show, after our show conversations, you and I have talked about how smart marketing doesn't much matter if we don't have team members rowing the boat in the same direction, adopting, pivoting, executing processes in the ways that we need to actually make the program successful. So we are groups of humans working on marketing projects, understanding how to motivate those humans and help make sure they do the behaviors we want is pretty critical in successful marketing campaigns.
Absolutely. And it's a myth that only consumers are affected by behavioral science principles. Just because you've walked through the office door doesn't mean that you have shedded your humanity. These principles that we discuss are as relevant on professionals and colleagues as much as consumers in the supermarket.
And as we were thinking about this episode, now almost more than ever, there are hesitations to really making the pivots and the adjustments, just thinking about adopting AI technology. More than ever before, it's been a challenge to say, well, we're going to try this, then we're going to try that, and we're going to adapt a learning mindset, and it's okay to try things that don't work out. This requires a lot of flexibility. It requires believing in whatever the company's direction is and really trying. There's a lot there to make to get people to buy into the direction that we want them to go in.
Yeah, whether it's a really breaking new technology like AI or something mundane like trying to change employees' dining habits, whatever you as a kind of leader, CEO, or employee, whatever you've set as a task, there are principles out there that can help you persuade your colleagues and employees to adopt those behaviors far more efficiently.
And in today's episode, we're going to argue, as we like to do, against classical economics alone, against classical psychological approaches alone. And we're going to make the argument that we might, in classical business, jump too fast to incentives and rewards, whether that's paying people more, giving PTO, the financial incentives, while they can work, we might be going to them too quickly. And so thinking about what we must do to motivate people more holistically, one, will have a chance of being more successful, and two, may save you and your company money before you jump to those as your first way to get people to change.
Yeah, it's a great point. The interventions don't need to be costly. And we're going to cover, I think, 4 different experiments. Each could be implemented at a reasonable or cost or no cost at all.
Yeah. So just for a little fun, before we get into the science and the background and the biases here, you worked at some pretty fancy agencies in your past. You've had great leaders that gave you great guidance and direction. Was there ever something in the corporate world that you just couldn't believe that they couldn't get the behavior change done? They just couldn't get where they want it?
Well, this should resonate with anyone that's ever worked in an agency. But every kind of month or so, there would be emails from the finance director, whatever agency I worked at, and the email would always be the same. It would be angry, there'd be lots of bold and underlining, lots of exclamation marks. And the essential point in there was, none of you idiots are filling in your timesheets. Please start doing it because it's critical for business. And then, nothing would change, and the next month we'd get another email. And it always made me chuckle because telling people that lots of their colleagues aren't behaving the way they're meant to transgresses a very important behavioral science principle.
We are going to talk much more
Yes.
about that in today's episode. But yes, focusing on how many people just aren't following the rules may fight against your interest more than you realize. And for me, I always watch wherever I am, whether it's at our offices here in New York or when I'm in clients' offices across the country, those that eat their lunch plates, eat their food, and then pile their dirty dishes. Either leave their dirty dishes at their wherever they were eating, or pile them in the sink. And I always thought, like, you surely don't do this at home. Like you surely don't do this at a guest house. But somehow the rules seem different at the office. And no matter how many times the office manager has asked people, please don't leave dirty dishes in the sink. There's a sign next to the sink that says, please put your dishes and glassware in the dishwasher. Somehow that behavior is very hard to change.
Yeah, there's a number of things I think in every office that prove again and again that if it was easy to change behaviour by just asking people or giving them a set of logical reasons, most of those problems would have disappeared by now. I think the constant the constant run of all these problems suggests that there's a different way that we need to ask people.
So let's get into it. Let's go to our first insight about human behavior and how it can help impact change within an office, change within your brand. How do we motivate our white collar colleagues to make a bigger difference? Where should we start today?
So I think we should start with what is one of the most important principles of behavioural science, which is social proof. And social proof is the argument that if you want to change behaviour, whatever it is you're trying to encourage, you need to make that behaviour look commonplace. Because if you make the behaviour look commonplace, more people are likely to adopt it. Now, often on our episodes, we've talked about brands applying this principle. But when it comes to internal behaviour change, I think there is an even more basic problem. Now, remember my example from timesheets. The FD was sending out an email saying lots of people aren't filling their timesheets out properly. That piece of communication is misusing social proof. It's what I would call negative social proof. It's emphasizing the scale of the unwanted behavior rather than the desirable behavior. And all the evidence suggests that will make the situation worse. The classic study in this particular area is from 2003. It's by Robert Cialdini. And he did an experiment at the Petrified Wood National Park in Arizona, where lots of tourists are going and stealing bits of petrified wood. They're taking them home as a souvenir, a memento. So he rigs up CCTV in a deserted area of the path. He points the CCTV cameras at a path, and then he sprinkles bits of petrified wood along the path. To begin with, he just monitors what proportion of visitors steal, and it's 2.9%. And then he tests a couple of interventions. First intervention, he puts up signs saying, please don't steal, it's wrong. And theft rates drop to 1.7%. So 1.7% of visitors are still stealing a bit of wood. That intervention is interesting because it shows you can change this negative behaviour. But the main crux of the experiment was Cialdini's final intervention, where he puts up a sign and he purposely misuses social proof. Now the sign says, 12 tonnes of wood are being stolen each year from the park and it's ruining the look of the park. Please don't steal, it's wrong. And there you see theft rates go to 7.9%. Now remember, in the control, it was 2.9%. So this is
the wrong
tripling.
way. We've gone the wrong way here.
We've gone the wrong way. Yes, that's the finding. Now, according to Cialdini, this is a crime promotion strategy, not a crime prevention strategy. He says, if you emphasise the scale of the antisocial behaviour, you remove a sense of transgression, you're using social proof in the wrong direction, you're encouraging the very behaviour you don't want. So the first thing for any employee to think about if they want to change the behavior of their colleagues is make sure they emphasize the scale of the desirable behavior, not the undesirable behavior.
And, at its face, that can seem a little tricky to do if you've got a big problem or you've got a lot of people not doing their timesheets, or let's, in this example, pretend there was already a lot of people stealing petrified wood. So one of the opportunities here is you could choose the promotion strategy or the prevention strategy that best meets your needs. So maybe instead of talking about the amount of people that are stealing or not doing their timesheets, you could talk even about the small amount of change, the growing compliance that you've been able to establish if you can show some momentum. So, you can always in your messaging focus on the thing that does show the positive behavior that you want, rather than making the mistake of focusing on the negative, which is why you're doing the intervention in the first place.
Absolutely. So your approach is to emphasize the glimmers of hope. And there are studies from Stanford, the 2017 study by Sparkman and Walton, which suggests that is a very powerful tactic. Now, they call this idea dynamic social proof, and they show that if you emphasize that there is a positive change in behavior, even if it is still very rarely done, if it's growing, that harnesses social proof very powerfully. So absolutely agree with that. The other thing you could always do is, whatever the scale of uptake, there's always going to be a variance in terms of individual employees. So if you looked at all your employees, you could identify the bottom 50%, the people who've done the least timesheets or the latest timesheets, and you could target that 50% discreetly and say, you are underperforming compared to your colleagues. So even if everyone in the company is failing to fill them in as quickly as possible, there is still going to be a subgroup who are doing it worse than average. They're even slower. They're the real laggards. Target them discreetly and compare them to their peers. You are doing worse than your peers. That is a very effective way of harnessing this principle.
So just taking this example one more step further, you have the idea, you target a subsection, you tell them they're doing worse than their peers, which would be A, factually true in the way you've broken it apart, and B, it helps them feel that pressure, that social proof pressure. If you had added something like, and those who have done their timesheets just 2 weeks in a row are get back on track with their peers or exceed, or much better. Does that add anything, or does that work against the conversation we're having?
I think we're starting to move into another bias here, which is, along with social proof, probably the most powerful out of the whole behavioural science kind of encyclopedia of insights. And it's the idea that small bits of friction tend to have a disproportionate effect. So what you're emphasising there is, let's create the impression that lots of people are behaving in the right way, and then emphasize to the misbehavers that it only takes a very, very small bit of action to get back on track. So I think we're combining here social proof and make it easy. And if you do that, you're absolutely right. You've got two very strong drivers of behavior being aligned. Now, people listening might think, okay, well, that feels such a trivial change. Surely it won't have an impact. But the interesting thing about friction is that it has a disproportionately large effect. People are constantly surprised by how even the most trivial barriers have an outsized effect on behaviour. So there's a brilliant study on professionals by Olshan. So it's a 2018 study, and he's at the Penn Medicine Unit. And Olshan and his colleagues were interested in, how can you change the behaviour of doctors? So the hospital wanted to get doctors prescribing generics, not branded drugs. And for people who aren't familiar with this kind of terminology, the branded drug is the expensive version that comes directly from a big pharma company. The generic is a cheaper one, which is pharmacologically the same, which has been made after that drug has come off patent. So there's a big financial incentive to get the doctors prescribing generics from the hospital's point of view. Now, Olshan looked at prescribing behaviour, and the particular hospital he looked at, what doctors did, once they had worked out what disease the patient had, they would go to their dashboard on the computer and there would be a drop-down menu of all the drugs they could think about prescribing. And the dashboard was ordered, this drop-down menu, branded drugs at the top, generics at the bottom. So if you wanted to order a generic, you had to scroll through for about 2 or 3 seconds all the way through the branded drugs. Now, when that setup was in place, 75% of the drugs prescribed were generics, 25% branded. Olshan then instigates a change. The drop-down menu is reversed. So now he looks at what happens when generic drugs at the top, branded drugs are at the bottom. And he finds that the proportion of drugs that are prescribed that are generics goes from 75% to 98%. So
wow,
branded, yeah, exactly. This is a massive, there's not much more effective it could be. But think about not just that it's a large impact, how trivial a piece of friction has been removed. This is saving doctors a couple of seconds of effort, but even that tiny bit of effort had this outsized effect.
It strikes me that I think of doctors as the most rational, as the most scientifically driven, logical of almost any population of people that Olshan could have decided to do this study with. So he chooses doctors, maybe because we all have this perception that they're so rational and so logical. And even this little bit of make it easy, even this little bit of change of the order of the drugs in a digital drop-down list has that much change. You know, that's it's striking to me.
Yes. If doctors, highly educated, highly logical, define themselves as being sensible decision makers, even they, when they're making life or death decisions, if even they are influenced by 2 or 3 seconds of effort, well, we can be sure the marketers are going to be far more influenced. So absolutely, I think this is quite a powerful study, and it should change how people approach some of these issues.
So the business takeaway right away is the easiest route. Making it easy should be at the very top of the list. Maybe social proof is number 1, and 1A is making it easy. And the message we're trying to focus on here is even the order of the options you give someone. You know, no matter how logical or rational the decision is, the ones that you put first, the ones that you make easiest to choose, are going to be the ones that get more focus.
Yeah. What tends to happen when we want to change the behavior of other people is most people default to thinking, how do I motivate my audience to want to change? So it might be around saying, you know, the financial importance of filling in timesheets promptly. What Olshan would suggest, though, is before you think of those things, begin by trying to identify what is stopping people filling in their timesheets. What are the little barriers, the little administrative barriers people have to go through to fill in the timesheets? So maybe with, you know, our hypothetical timesheet system, people have to fill in a password which is a mix of characters, numbers, capital letters, non-capital letters. Maybe you think, well, rather do that, we could get fingerprint identification, or you know, we could have pre-populated forms, or there could be one quick click through to filling the timesheet rather than, you know, 10 steps. It'd be focused on this removal of friction and effort rather than thinking straight away about appeal and motivation.
It brings up examples where other companies have famously done this, and maybe one that our listeners have heard of is Google. In their offices offers unlimited snacks and unlimited food. But a big change they did was they would move the healthiest food to be the easiest places to reach, and more of the indulgent snacks, the sodas, go lower in the refrigerator, go higher up where you have to open a bin. You know, the candies get put in earthen colored, opaque colored jars, where the healthy food is in transparent glasses and open containers. So even that little bit of friction of the less healthy food being a little bit harder to get to and the healthier options are the easier ones to get to.
Yeah.
We've seen lots of companies adopt that, and that leads to very good
Yeah.
results.
And if any listeners skeptical about whether that had an effect or not, there's a very similar study by Paul Rosen at the University of Pennsylvania where he looked at trying to encourage vegetable consumption. So he works with a cafeteria and they randomize the setup. So one day you go in and you have to use tongs to get the broccoli or the green beans. Other times it'll be a big serving spoon. Sometimes the broccoli is right by you as you walk down the corridor. Other times he pushes it just 6 inches further away from you. And what he finds is when people have the easy serving spoon and the vegetables are nearby, there's about 8 to 15% increase in vegetable consumption. So that example from Google, it is proven in very similar circumstances to be very effective. Yet people consistently are skeptical about the importance of friction, and because people are skeptical and because they don't have the right calibration in their mind about the impact of friction, they tend not to think about it enough. They tend not to put enough effort into removing these little barriers.
It's funny. This may be a adjacent idea or a close cousin of what we're talking about. The very first time you and I sat in a room together, I remember a study that we went to, and I think it's Vermont or it may be New Hampshire, and they're trying to increase organ donations. And the question is whether you have to check the box in order to become an organ donor, or whether you have to uncheck, or whether you have to check that you would not like to be an organ donor, right? They changed the default of what the check is for. Do you remember this study?
Yeah. Oh, no, they sort of. So now this is an interesting one because there's a bit of a nuance here. So yeah, there's a famous graph that's often you'll see kind of retweeted or posted about, and the one I've seen, there might be a version with American states, but there's a European one which looks at all the countries in Europe and whether they are opt-in or opt-out to the organ donor list. And what you see is if countries are opt-in, you get about 5 or 10% of the population enrolling. If they are opt-out, i.e. you are assumed to want to give your organs away upon death unless you actively tell the state you don't want to, in that setting, you get about 95% of people on the organ donor list. So at first glance, it looks like this amazing piece of evidence for the power of Make It Easy. But there is a bit of a twist, which is, yes, it boosts the number of people on the organ donor list, but it doesn't increase the actual number of organs that the state collects. So what tends to happen, certainly in Europe, is if you're in a horrible situation, a relative has died in a car crash, and you are asked, is it okay for us doctors to take the organ? Families are much more likely to say no if it was opt out rather than opt in, because they might say, well, look, my wife or my husband, yes, they were on the organ donor list, but they never actively chose to be on it. I don't know what their opinions were. I'm not happy for you to take the organs. And no Western democracy is going to override the wishes of the nearest family. So in that setting, what you really need is active sign up to kind of assuage the concerns of the nearby family. So I think that's a case where it gets one metric jumping, number of people on the organ donor list, but it doesn't actually change the underlying metric which is needed, which is willingness to let the organs of a loved one go.
I think it's a lot. I did not know the nuances there, and that's super helpful to hear, because even if we get the numbers right, even if we can show more data, if it doesn't actually lead to more organs being donated, have we really achieved our end goal? Yeah. So we can guide and lead people. We can set up, opt-outs versus opt-ins, but if it doesn't actually get to the ultimate behavior change we want, how successful was all the interventions on the way?
And if we go back to our timesheets example, if you make it easier for people to log into their timesheets, my hypothesis would be that will lead to far more people following it. However, let's say in a a hypothetical company, you've actually got this large group of people who hate the company. They're trying to bring it down from the inside. Encourage them to log in won't change the problem because they are actively resentful of the need to fill in timesheets. They'll probably push back in other ways. So I think absolutely you've got to work out where the real friction point is.
So we've talked, that's super helpful to talk through. So we've talked about two big ones already. We have the idea of social proof and make it easy. These folks might have even guessed. Our longtime listeners, they might have even guessed we might start there. The next one might be a little bit more of a surprise.
Yes. So I think there are some situations where companies might think, well, let's encourage people to adopt a very specific behavior by offering them money. Now, that can be effective, but there are some surprising ways of maximizing the impact of cash incentives. And one of our previous guests, Uri Gnesi, who's a behavioral economist at UCSD, has done some research into what he calls a regret lottery. And this provides some counterintuitive ideas to make cash incentives as effective as possible. So he does this experiment with an unnamed training company. And the setup for this training company is the attendees some of them will drive to the office. And if they do so, there is a $9 cost to the training company. They have to use someone else's car park. So the training company are trying to then encourage the attendees to get public transport. So what Gnesi suggests is randomizing the attendees into 4 different groups. The first group, the control, get no message about why they shouldn't use public transport. So they act as a benchmark. The second group are told, if you don't drive, we will give you $5 per day. So that's kind of fixed reward. The third group are told, if you don't drive, we'll enter you into a $500 lottery. So these are all quite successful so far. If you offer people a $5 reward, you get a 10% reduction in driving. If you enter people into the lottery, you get an 18% reduction in car driving. Now, it's worth stressing here is that because of the volume of people coming to the training course, that lottery also worked out as cheaper. So $500 was cheaper than giving every person $5. So first insight from Gnesi is, rather than jumping to giving people a fixed reward for adopting behavior, why not enter them into a lottery, give them an uncertain reward? Because people tend to be overconfident about their probability of winning, it tends to change behavior more effectively. But then the fourth and final group, and this is where it gets interesting, this is the counterintuitive bit. Gnesi says, well, actually, before you jump to the straightforward lottery, why not try what he calls a regret lottery? So, standard lottery, if you partake in the desired behavior, you don't drive. You are then entered into the lottery and they'll pick one of the people who has behaved well and they will then be told they're the winner. In a regret lottery, it's slightly different. Everyone, whether they have done the behavior that's desired or not done it, they are all entered into the lottery. A name is then pulled out. The person is told you have been pulled out, and then they check whether they have done the unwanted or wanted behavior. And if they haven't done the desired behavior, they haven't, in this case, used public transport, they are told, I'm sorry, you can't collect your prize, we're chucking your name away, and we're going to pull another name out. And that is the most effective of all the interventions. There you get this 26% reduction in car driving. And I think that is a costless tweak to the lottery approach that harnesses loss aversion to make people far more likely to behave in the way that they should.
The regular lottery was an 18% reduction, the regret lottery, a 26% reduction. That's 8 points more just by changing the way the lottery is won.
Yes, you're not giving away more cash. What you're doing instead is letting people know that if they don't behave in the proper way, there is a chance that they are within tantalizing distance of getting the prize. They are told they would have won and then it's snatched away. Whereas, of course, in the regular lottery, if I just drive in and can't be bothered, I'll never know whether I would have been the winner. My name's never put in the pot, so who knows whether I would have won? And it's this twist into making that loss much more salient, much more concrete. That's what drives that extra 8 points of behavior change.
I think what you just highlighted is really the key for me. It's by creating an anticipation of regret, it
Yes.
motivates more people to comply. And this really takes advantage of another major insight in behavioral science called loss aversion, which is that humans prefer avoiding losses over acquiring an equivalent gain. We talked about this in previous episodes, popularized by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They found that the pain of a loss is felt more intensely than the pleasure of an equal gain. In fact, they've showed that you would need almost double the gain to offset a loss, meaning if you were going to lose $10, you would have to gain almost $20 to offset the pain of the potential loss of 10. So there's really this innate human fear of losing out, that this aversion to loss that's very strong in all of us.
Absolutely. And by harnessing that, you don't have to spend any more money as a company. You give people the same financial prize, but by changing the kind of psychological impact that goes around that prize, you get a very different result. So there's one element which is use a lottery over a fixed reward, but then I think more interestingly, more surprising to everyone listening, is consider using the regret lottery over the standard lottery.
So for those that would like to hear more about this, Ori spoke about this in episode 78. We'll put it in the show notes. People can go and click on it. But what strikes me, Richard, is that for this to really work, for a regret lottery to be effective, the creative that you use for people to know about this really has to be clear. And so I don't know exactly how he did it in the study, but just talking about it now, you would almost have to say, congratulations, here is your entry into the lottery. Like you're entered into the lottery, but only those that don't park have a chance to win. At 3:00, we're pulling the ticket. Make sure that you can claim your $500 prize by not parking in the parking lot and using public transportation today. Am I on the right road? Like, if you don't advertise it, it's not going to work. You have to advertise it correctly.
And I think this is one of the reasons why we've got it in this episode about internal behavior change rather than a discussion about consumers. It does require a little bit of explanation. But if you've got attendees coming to a training session or you've got employees, you have the ability to talk to them in more depth than a consumer. And a consumer, you've got to win their attention, and it's very hard, and you'll just get a second or two. With an employee, there's a bit more of an expectation that they will read the messaging of the CEO or they will listen to what HR say. Now, don't push that too far. They might ignore you sometimes, but there's certainly going to be more engagement. So I think the necessity for explanation of the regret lottery means it's probably generally better used on internal employees than external customers.
So this is a way that you can run a lottery and supercharge the output by making a regret lottery. One thing you said when you were going through that was, importantly, a $500 lottery was less expensive than giving every person $5. So not only was it more impactful, it actually cost the company less overall because it's only one $500 prize rather than every person getting a $5 voucher.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's quite important because if you don't emphasize that, people might think, well, wait a minute, $500 is bigger than $5. Therefore, of course, the company spends more money, they'll change behavior more effectively. But actually, because not everyone got the lottery prize, it was actually cheaper in terms of expenses for the company than giving a fixed $5 reward in this setting.
So it's a win-win on both sides. So as we go to our final insight here, we have one more that can help make sure we don't jump to cash incentives too quickly.
Yes, exactly. There, I think, is a tendency in companies to think that the best way to motivate employees is to use cash incentives. Um, there's a wonderful study from 1995 by Kaplan Education Centre, and they get lots of lawyers who are about to join the profession, and they ask them two questions. Why do you want to join the profession? And why do you think your peers on the university course want to join the profession? And when people answer about themselves, the most popular answer is the intellectual challenge, you know the kind of how interesting this topic and career is going to be. When they answer for other people, they say something very differently. They say, "Oh, I think though most of my peers who are joining, they're motivated. Their key motivation is the cash, the good salary. Intellectual stimulation is far lower." So the study here, and there's similar ones by the University of Chicago, suggest people think they are joining for intellectual challenge. They think other people are joining for cash. Now, if you are a manager at a company and you think the main reason people are motivated is with cash, you'll jump to that solution far too quickly. But actually, creating a sense of purpose and value to people's work is something you should start with first. So there's a wonderful study from Dan Ariely, who we've interviewed previously, and Prelec, and it's a 2008 study. And what they do is they ask people to build Lego toys. And the first toy that the participant builds, they get $2. The second toy they build, they get $1.89. The third, $1.78, and so on and so forth. Every next toy gets 11 cents less. They have a fixed amount of time to try and build as many as possible. The twist in the experiment is some people build the toys and they put them on a shelf, and then they build another, and they can see their work accumulating in front of them. Those people are told, when you finish, we will disassemble the toys and we'll give the pieces to the next participant. But they get to see their work growing in front of them. The second group get the same financial incentive. They have to build the same amount of, or they have to build as many toys as they can. But this time, once they've finished the toy, they're given the parts for the next toy, and in front of them, the researcher dismantles the toy they've just built. So they keep on
evil.
seeing that it is evil. You've got to. I mean, we should have asked Dan about where this one came up from in his mind. There is an evilness to this one. So the work is shown to be completely pointless. People are seeing their work being dismantled in front of them. And what Ariely and Prelec find is that the amount of toys built varies massively between the two groups. So first group, who see their work growing in scale, they build 10.6 toys on average. The second group, who have the toys dismantled in front of them, they build just 7.2. So to put that another way, people who see the purpose and value of their work, they will build 47% more toys than the people in this slightly Sisyphean, pointless setup.
It's a shocking difference in the output, but innately, if you see your work being taken apart as you're trying to do the next one, you just can feel how that would be defeating. You could feel how it would get in the way of your motivation to keep going.
Yeah, it's almost like a shorthand for demotivating. getting prisoners to dig holes and then fill them in again. I mean, I think that's probably where the inspiration came from. But why I love this study is when we talk about purpose at work, we often think about really extreme types of purpose. You know, the A&E doctor who is saving a car crash victim's life by their amazing surgery, or the teacher in an inner city school who inspires someone into a love of English. You know, they are very extreme versions of purpose. What this study shows is that even a modicum of purpose, even this tiny sliver of meaning, you know, actually seeing your work build up in front of you, that can increase motivation. So I think the outtake for employers is one, to think that people are more motivated by the purpose of their work than cash, and then second, or than we think, and then secondly, the purpose that you imbue the task that you're trying to encourage. It doesn't have to be grandiose. Just giving people a simple explanation to some of the value can boost that uptake of work.
It's what comes to mind for me is Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive, and he has these three interconnected circles: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And when those things are all being filled, those are more important to white collar workers than pay alone. And so you using the term purpose, in Dan Pink's model, it may be mastery, that they're seeing that their input, that their effort is building visually on the shelf. And so I think, you know, different models call things slightly different things. But to me, that idea that they had purpose and then they saw the building effect of the mastery of what they were doing growing, to me feels like that's what you're taking away through the researcher taking it apart. And what we maybe do unintentionally so often in companies is we don't let people see their wins build up. We don't let people feel the achievement grow. And that could be very defeating, especially for white collar workers.
Yeah, I was thinking for the timesheet example, and we're just using the timesheet as, you know, a simple demonstration of some of these principles. It's not the only way you can use them. But I was kind of thinking, often in companies, you get dictatorial, authoritarian middle managers telling their team, you've got to do it. It's a mandate from on high. What would be better is just a sentence or two of explaining why this task is so important. You know, that I think would be enough to tap into some of this principle. There are more creative ways, of course, that you can do this. There's some lovely work by Adam Grant who showed that if you wanted to motivate call center staff to generate more alumni donations, one of the best ways to do it was to bring in a previous recipient of a grant into the call center to explain what a difference it made to their life. You know, they're not surgeons, they're not pilots in the army, they're not inspirational teachers, but even in that kind of call center setting, seeing that your work has meaning and can really affect someone's life, and hearing it directly from the beneficiary, that had a huge impact on the amount of donations people managed to generate.
That to me speaks directly to purpose. I love that connection because you just see why, as a call center employee, what you are doing really can make a big difference. Yeah, these are lovely examples. I think the watch out for us is for if you're seeking behavior change internally in your company, how are you thinking about what else is surrounding the request that might be demotivating or might be hindering people's want to continue to participate in that behavior that you're seeking?
Excellent.
And so
Yeah.
that brings us to the end of this very interesting conversation. Richard, we went through 4 studies. Do you want to just quickly sum up for us the 4 major topics that we hit?
So the first thing we talked about was social proof, but in particular, avoiding negative social proof. And what we mean by that is do not fall for the tactic of emphasizing the scale of the problem. If you tell your employees that lots of them are misbehaving, the evidence from Cialdini and others is that you'll make the situation worse. So what you want to be doing is honestly emphasizing either the volume of positive behavior the growing number of people behaving positively, or discreetly telling the worst performers how they are performing worse than their peers. So lots of different solutions there. We then talked about the key principle of make it easy. We talked about the Olshan experiment with doctors, in which the tiny removal of 3 or 4 seconds of effort radically increased the prescription rates for generics over branded. Now, the argument there was, if a rational group like doctors, who define themselves as being evidence-based decision makers, if they can be really influenced by the removal of tiny little barriers, it's certainly going to occur amongst marketers. The third point we talked about was, how do you maximize the impact of cash incentives? And we talked about the Ganesi study, which firstly suggested that often uncertain rewards, like a lottery, can beat fixed rewards. And more counterintuitively, this lovely idea from Ganesi that a regret lottery can be even more effective than a standard one. So a costless intervention. It's just as expensive to do a regret lottery as a normal lottery. So this costless change can boost the impact of that money. And then finally, we talked about the misconception many of us have. We recognise we are driven by concerns like interest and intellectual contribution, but we think other people are driven just by money. It's not that I'm naive in saying money is unimportant, but we overestimate its role on other people. So before you think about giving people cash incentives, make sure that the first thing you've done is make them realise the value, the role, the purpose of the work they're doing. Do that first, and then follow with cash incentives. Those are the big 4 things we discussed.
As always, we will take the studies and the show notes. It will be on our website, theconsumerbehaviorlab.com. And if you found today's episode interesting, if you had questions, if you wanted to discuss anything, please connect with us over LinkedIn. If you thought that something that we talked about today would be interesting to others, please share what you heard. And we're always on the hunt for questions for us to cover on the podcast, for recommendations on brands that you'd like to hear more about. So feel free to reach out to Richard and I. And until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Thanks so much for listening.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Recognized as one of the fastest growing companies in America for the 3rd year in a row, featured on Inc.'s 5,000 list. Method One is a proudly independent creative and media agency grounded in behavioral science. They exist to make brands irresistible, helping people discover products, services, and experiences that bring moments of joy to their lives. As behavior change experts, Method One creates emotional connections that drive true brand value for their clients, focusing primarily with indulgence brands in the CPG space. Find out more at methodone.com.